Hi, everybody. I'm back with the Postkahanism podcast. I'm here with Mr. Dictator's Den, um, who hopefully we'll be having on regularly to do book reviews of interesting 20th century literature, maybe more than 20th century. And today we'll be discussing a book that I read about 15 years ago, and Mr. Dictator's Den has read recently, called The Forsaken by a gentleman named Tim Tsouliadis. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's a Greek-British author. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it for everybody, not just because it's very well written. It's a very heartbreaking story, but also because it sheds a lot of light on 20th century history from an angle that is very seldom discussed. Um, Boss, you wanna tell them about the book?
Yeah. So obviously, I think Baruch and I have been reading about, Stalin and just various parts of the just giant USSR state for a long time. And this is I just read this book recently, but I was actually amazed by how this would be just if you had not read anything on just, let's say, the 1930s, this would be a pretty excellent just introductory point because it covers like how the terror started. It also covers, the parts like I had learned about Victor Herman and coming out of the ice from you, but oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just want to give our audience a little bit of an overview of what the book's about.
Yeah.
So the book discusses Americans who ended up being abandoned in the Soviet Union from the
And then
1930s. Yeah, from
and then
the
abandoned in Siberia.
right from the 30s, from 1930s onwards, ending up with even various POWs from World War II and the Korean War,
Yeah.
and kind of it uses them and their life journey as kind of a microcosm to tell about 20th century history, right?
Yes. No, I mean, I did not know about Thomas Segovia, who was an artist, but yeah, they went to the Soviet Union because, and I think it's important to tell this point because I've been reading some like communist memoirs and, you know, they just always emphasize like in the 30s how poor the United States was. And it's frankly a poverty that, we don't see today. So I think these are often appalling people, not all of them, but you have to understand that they, believe that this was better. They didn't take their children there because they were trying to put their children in an orphanage. They took them there because they thought they would be living a better life. And go
Right,
ahead.
right, right. So in the 1930s, the situation was in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, the Soviet Union had a huge industrial plant,
Yeah,
meaning its industrial capital. It was not, when I say plant, I don't mean one plant, I mean a bunch of
yeah,
plants um, that they'd inherited from the Tsar,
yeah,
except that there was nobody to run all this machinery. There was nobody to run all these factories. Their engineers and their skilled workers, a lot of them had died off during the revolution, the Civil War, or had simply fled overseas.
yeah,
And they wanted to get all the stuff online and modernized so that they could get into the war that they saw coming very clearly, or wanted to start themselves.
yeah,
Opinions vary. So what they did, they made a lot of deals with Wall Street. They had a guy named Albert Kahn who was an industrial architect, I think probably the first industrial architect in the world, who actually, from Wall Street, who actually wrote their first 5 year plan. And their 5 year plans were like a series of sequences of how are we going to get our heavy industry online, right? And then they said, okay, we have all this stuff. Who's going to run it? Who's going to teach our people to run it? And they imported a simply tremendous amount of American engineers and even factory foremen,
yes,
uh, which was made easier by the fact the U.S. had entered the Great Depression. A lot of people had gotten laid off, and there were a lot of people with kind of like leftist leanings. So they had completely in the open these programs to go, hey, come to Russia, make a ton of money, kind of similar to how blue collar guys would go to work in Iraq as contractors on these big bases, like plumbers making $150,000 a year or whatever, and you'll be like the star of the show, right?
Yeah.
So they all
Uh,
came to Russia in the early 30s, right? That's like how the
yes.
book starts out.
And they talk about like, just Henry Ford, he had this giant plant. Um, and the Soviet Union, they liked, they were not above borrowing things from the West, like Fordism and Taylorism, the assembly line stuff, how to manufacture cars. They loved all that stuff. They thought it would be perfect. So they get with Henry Ford, who is, of course, a notorious anti-Semite. He's also doesn't like communists, but they're like, we'll give you 40 million 1930s dollars. And so he's like, okay, well, I guess, the Jews, the Bolsheviks, whatever, this is good money. So he
Commies do
does
be
some,
okay sometimes.
yeah. So he does something very interesting where he basically, this is a very permanent sort of black mark on whatever other things he did, but he got Samuel Herman, who was Victor Herman's father, and many other people to basically say, hey, you're going here from my company to the USSR, but we're going to you're actually technically not working for it. So you're going to go there and you're going to make good money and it's going to be great. And yeah, so he went there and a lot of them did. And you know, they basically the first thing they did was they took people's passports, and it's not always clear. I think they took them because the book thinks that they were using them for agents, for like to make fake passports to get into the US, but the people, they just said, oh, we're just holding them. And I think the author said something like, well, if you steal someone's passport and you alter it or whatever, then they are an inconvenient witness to identity theft. So you don't really want them to ever leave after witnessing. So all these workers are there in these factories without passports, and they notice that immediately the circumstances are not nearly as good as they thought. Like the Russians don't do the assembly line stuff right. They wipe like the dyes used for the tools, they use their coats to wipe it down. It starts to burn holes. Like it's completely insane and unprofessional how, and none of the quotas are met. Um, and so eventually the Russians start to they're like, well, no, these Americans are wreckers, or some of the ones they're sabotaging us. And we might be jumping ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not
We're
trying
jumping ahead.
to.
We're jumping ahead a little bit. So
Okay.
right, all that stuff happens, and of course, getting your passport taken by somebody when you come to a foreign country to work for them is something that usually happens in like human trafficking, right? To like
Yeah.
you know East European hookers or whatever. Like this is a very very like no bueno sign. It's interesting that Henry
Yeah.
Ford at the same time was doing something was very closely involved in the Great Migration of black people from the American South to Detroit to work in his factories. And in fact,
Yeah.
he had this extensive network of, in the South, he had black preachers who were working for guys who were working for Ford, who were arranging kind of the feeder arm of
Oh
all
wow.
this. And yeah, yeah, yeah.
I didn't know that.
There's a book by a guy named, what was this guy's name? This guy actually sucks. He's like the anti-Semitic Bill Nye the Science guy, E. Michael Jones. But the book's very good.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
book's called The Slaughter of Cities, and
Yeah.
it's a great
Okay.
book. Highly recommend to everybody. Very well researched, and he discusses some of the stuff there. And
Yeah.
he brings he brings receipts. So Ford was doing like industrial human trafficking on a mass scale, and all these people. It was this weird convergence because people in America at the time, like academics, were super hyped about big planned
Yeah.
economy projects,
Sure.
giant farms in Montana, and gigantic factories. And um, Columbia University was all about all this stuff, and the New Deal was basically all this. So they were doing things that were in parallel, except for Russia was doing it in a much more kind of primitive and brutal way than the New Deal. So these guys all come to Russia and everything's hunky dory except for like there's constantly trouble in paradise. And like these people look very kind of hungry, and and why are they handling battery acid with their bare hands? Why are there no gloves?
Yeah.
And why is all this stuff happening? But at the same time, they bring their families, they bring their kids there. The kids are like, wow, great, we'll play baseball and we'll
Yeah.
skydive and we'll, all this stuff. And there's these adoring newspaper articles. They bring black workers there. And there's all these like woo-woo newspaper articles about how, back in America, these people are discriminated against, but not here in
Yeah.
Russia. And what happens then is like the Great Terror starts kicking off.
Yeah.
And it starts off like people think like the Great Terror was like 1937, and that was like its
No.
height. But right, actually had industrialization parallel with all this industrialization stuff. You had the industrialization of the countryside where they were like, listen, these people in the cities are going to need to eat stuff, and also you want people from the countryside to have a reason to move to the cities. Therefore, if you're in the countryside, give me all your food. And
Yes.
there's this mass famine, and at the same time,
Yep.
there's this big core of Western horse, I mean, journalists
Right.
who are in Moscow, and these guys are like having the best time of their life. They're in a hotel
Yeah.
called the Metropole, right? You want to talk
Yep.
about this part a little?
Yeah. So, the most famous of these people is of course Walter Duranty, but there was a bunch of them. Like, in that book, The Red Decade, which Eugene Lyons was a journalist there, and he wrote about Russia. He has a book called Assignment in Utopia, where he went there for UPI during the period you're talking about. And he actually wrote about it because he was so disgusted with it. But a lot of the other journalists, like Muggeridge was there too with all these people. He knew these people too. He didn't like they didn't always like and dislike the same ones, but the person that seems like the biggest just piece of garbage is Durante because he went to um like Ukrainian region and witnessed the famine, and he just wrote the most ridiculous stuff, like either downplaying or saying, "Oh, it was just minor," and just stuff that there's no way. Like some of these people, like I think Louis Fisher and Maurice Hindus, not like I think it's spelled Hindoos. They saw this stuff and they wrote the 2 + 2 = 5 stuff. But it seemed like just from what I've read that they felt guilty about doing it and they just did not. There's something that felt wrong. The impression I get from what I've read about Durante is that he was basically knew that he was doing this stuff. I'm not even sure if he was even a Bolshevik. I think he just liked the clout and the power, and he was almost nihilistic about it. That's the impression I get from him later. I don't know what's in his head, but he wrote just, he basically covered up this just awful, just gigantic starvation campaign that was, of course, done basically deliberately, and there was no, like, it's not clear necessarily what the U.S. could have done, but because I think when like Hoover was sending grain to the USS, what was it called, the UNRRA or something, at the end of World War I, the Russian, the
The
Bolsheviks,
Bavolja, yeah.
they were just confiscating it. But it's one thing to just admit that, but it's another thing to just cover up just something like that, like a. What I
Right.
don't know the death toll if it's like I think it's like 7 million, something like that.
There
It's
were
millions of
nobody knows.
people.
Millions of
Yeah,
people died, and it was completely like it was completely intentional. It was completely man-made, and it was brutal
yes.
and sustained. Durante was the correspondent for I think the New York Times, and he got a Pulitzer
Yeah,
for
he
his
was.
reporting work.
Yeah, he did.
And his reporting work was like these people, the inmates in Auschwitz are so happy and healthy.
Yeah.
It's just wonderful. They're smiling and dancing, and you just hear the sounds of their happy songs everywhere. Like it was that level of insanity. But the thing that really stuck with me, Tsouliadis writes, is that these guys all hung out at a hotel called the
Yeah.
Metropole, and it was like a five-star hotel
Yeah.
in the early 30s when people in Russia were like, starving. And these
Yes.
guys were eating caviar and drinking champagne and stuff. And the really cool thing about the Metropole is there were all these multilingual, beautiful,
Yeah.
graceful Russian girls that were super interested in you and really loved to hang out with like foreigners. And and actually they were very cultured because they all
They're
came from,
aristocrats.
yes, they
They're
were
whites. Yeah.
the daughters of aristocrats who had been killed off or whatever during the revolution. And the only problem with them was that you get to get friendly with one and everything else, so your relationship would be going well. She'd disappear, but then another one
Yep.
showed up immediately, and these guys were joking about it, and they were like, "Yeah, you can't get too close to them. You just have another drink, buddy." So these guys knew that they were these women were basically being
All
trafficked
right.
and disappeared by the OGPU or the NKVD at the time. Um,
Just as one quick
yeah,
aside about the white Russian women, and this is like another horrible anecdote, but I don't remember. Maybe we talked about Field in the last episode, but when he was traveling to China, um, he was on this cargo ship that was, I guess, was going along the Pacific coast, near Vladivostok. And he said that there was a knock on the door of him and his wife's cabin, and it was a prostitute. And she asked if she could negotiate where she would give them a piece of her earnings if she could use their bed. And apparently she was a white Russian young woman, and she fled. And they sort of, that whole, like, the ship trade going along the Pacific was full of white immigrants. And Luigi Barzini has a thing where he would just talk about he'd sleep with these or like these prostitutes in, I don't know, they'd gone to like somewhere in Europe, I guess more Western Europe, and he would like sleep with them and they would just start crying because they were like, this is what they were reduced to. And, they certainly were just one of the many. But I thought that, like, I read that and he was like just kind of chuckling about it in his book. But I was like, that's pretty grotesque, man. Like, that's pretty horrifying. And this was not an isolated incident. Like, there were probably tens of thousands of these, women doing this sort of thing.
There were tremendous amounts, but at least like there were many white immigrants in Harbin in China, uh,
Yes, yes.
and also in
Manchuria.
yeah, in the Balkans and in France, and many of these people were reduced to poverty, and they've been middle class, upper middle class people, and they were reduced to poverty, all kinds of terrible things to survive. But here they were just being pimped by the OGPU
Yeah.
and periodically disappeared. Um,
What do you think happened? Like, I mean, do you think they just became some like NKVD's like kind of groupie in some other part of the empire? Do you think they were gulag? It never really said what happened to these women. It
who
seems like they'd
knows?
be too valuable to kill, like because they could get
Uh,
intelligence.
they killed off all kinds of people in the 1930s. I know in the 1980s the KGB was doing the same exact thing with prostitutes in the places that Westerners would go, Moscow and Leningrad.
Yeah.
Um, so who knows? Who knows? But anyway, the arrests started happening and people started disappearing, and all these Americans at first, it was just kind of funny, haha. Like all these Russians kind of seemed scared, and hey, we got a knock on the door at 3 in the morning. These guys came in and were like, "Oh, sorry," with their trench coats and closed the door, and then
Yeah.
open some other door.
Yeah.
And but eventually, they start feeling it, and they start trying to escape. And it turns out that either they don't have a passport or they have two passports, meaning that
Yes.
the Soviets didn't take their passport, but they were like, "Hey, would you like Soviet citizenship?" "Oh yeah, sure. Well, here's your Soviet passport, sir." And then the Soviets are like to the American
That's the
embassy,
most
"Well,
recent one.
this guy's got two
That
passports.
that override
One's
the new one
American,
overrides the old one. Yeah.
right? One's American, one's Soviet. The Soviet one is newer than the American one, therefore we have priority on him." And the American embassy just goes, "Huh."
Yeah, that's the weird thing to me. Like, I've read enough about like the State Department and just how just you could say, okay, well, they're starting all these wars everywhere. They're doing all this stuff that's probably not good. But on the upside, okay, I'm an American, so if I get into a jam abroad, the embassy will have my back because, you know, but the US embassy didn't even help the people who were citizens that work there. Like, it's insane. They did nothing for these people, like, at all. They just like let them get dragged out, and they didn't
Right,
even like, they sent like a memo. Like, I think one time Kennan, we'll get to that later, he like sent some harshly worded memo like, I really don't like this. And it's like, oh, cool. Wow, that's Stalin is probably terrible, you know, like, that's
right.
really good of you to make a stand in this memo that like two people are going to read. And I don't know, but
Right. So exactly. So these people go to the U.S. embassy and they would go, "Hey, I got to get out of here." And the U.S. embassy would go, "Huh, okay, well, maybe we'll talk to you later about that." And these people would leave and get arrested immediately outside,
yeah,
and disappear. And the U.S. embassy was like, "Huh, never followed up with us. What are the
yeah,
odds?" Just like all the other ones. And I guess that's not a problem. Well, look, it's lunchtime already, and this seems like from the book, it seems like this was policy that was dictated by the ambassador and probably by people above the ambassador. So who's above the ambassador is like the executive level, um,
Secretary of State. Yeah,
Secretary of State and the president. And
yeah,
all these people end up, but they obviously, like, when you say somebody disappears, like, no, they don't disappear. They got arrested. They got interrogated in, mid mid to late 30s NKVD style, meaning tortured,
yeah.
and they all confessed. there was by this point in the from the mid 1930s onwards, they built basically um, an industrial sort of torture pipeline
Yeah.
where these people had a whole, it was like a factory. You'd go in, you'd come out having confessed to whatever crazy, like insane confessions. I
Yes.
worked with the intelligence services of Papua New Guinea to turn back the rivers that flow from Siberia
Yeah.
into the Arctic, to turn
Yeah.
them backwards so they would flow into Inner Mongolia, like crazy shit like that.
Yeah.
And then you'd get your sentence, which was either to be executed or to go to Siberia, and off you'd go.
Yeah.
The ones that got executed, they got executed, and their families were told later, eventually, that hey, this guy got sick and died. And
Yeah.
maybe decades later, they'd be told, hey, this person, actually we killed him, and this is something that happened, to tens of thousands of Americans, but millions of Soviet citizens.
Yeah.
But the ones that went off to the Gulag, this is kind of where the book continues the story, right? So
Yeah.
the Gulag, right? The Gulag was kind of like the Nazi concentration camp system. It wasn't just a place to destroy humans and dispose of them. It was a massive industrial operation, right?
Yeah. So the I guess this kind of ties into a slight digression, but it's about the same thing if that's okay in terms of the selling of antiques to like the American ambassadors like uh what's his name? Joseph Davies, the Mission to Moscow guy. And they have all this, the Russians needed gold. Like Stalin basically was in a bad spot where the ruble was worthless, so they needed either American dollars or something to trade. So they had to sell this stuff, so like antiques, and they would sell them to foreigners. So there's people like, Andrew Mellon, I think, was the former Secretary of the Treasury during the 20s. He bought just like warehouses worth of this Russian art. And Davies was married to the heiress of the Post cereal thing, so they had a bunch of money. So we can get to him more later, but I just wanted to add the reason the Russians were selling all this stuff because they needed the dollars. And they got this American guy, and this is what sort of led to the gulags being made in Kolyma. They what was his name? It was Jack. They found an American. They brought him to the Soviet Union, and they had him look for. He was a geologist. He was working in Alaska, and they found just this very rich gold vein in Siberia. This is like close to the Bering Strait. This is like one of the coldest, worst places. The catch was it was an amazing gold source, but who are you going to get to mine this gold? Because it's a horrible condition. Oh, wait, we're going to get political prisoners to mine the gold. And so that's why they started sending them there. I mean, they knew they were going to get exterminated, but they wanted that gold. They needed as much as they could to buy stuff like Henry Ford's, plants or whatever, or, you know, anything really, because they didn't have like a good currency of their own, I guess. I mean, is that how you would kind of,
Yes, yes. Exactly. There's two separate aspects of this. So one thing is that they needed, as you said, they needed all this money to reindustrialize. They needed it to buy equipment. They needed it to pay American engineers and foremen because they weren't going to pay these guys in, smoked sausage, right? Um, and so they needed all this foreign currency. And as you said, there, the ruble was basically crap. And it wasn't just gold, right? They were selling a tremendous amount. First of all, looted antiques, as you said. There was like the personal touch where they were selling to people, but there was also, looted gold, and there was just a river of this stuff being pushed
yeah,
out of Russia. Also, if I'm not mistaken, they were exporting grain even while they were expropriating from their peasants. And of course, these slave camps, aside from gold, um, which by the way they were mining with American equipment. Um,
yes,
right? So the Americans were benefiting from this coming and going, but also things like lumber,
yeah,
tremendous lumber trade with the West, and all this stuff was harvested by slave labor. I mean, you want to talk about blood diamonds?
yeah,
This was going on in Europe, and these people were being worked and starved to death. Because if you think about the fact that quote unquote free Russians or free Soviet citizens working in Ford factories were like wiping acid off of dyes
Yeah.
with their sleeve of their jacket. Not like they were like, oh, that's okay, I got lots of jackets.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what the working conditions were like in the gulag. That's one aspect. Another aspect, at the same time, and I believe Tsouliadis mentions this in his book, there was a funny thing going on with gold during the New Deal because FDR said, listen, the price of gold is this much, and also you're not allowed to have any of your like private ownership of
Oh
gold.
yeah,
So
he seized all the gold. I mean, I'm sure people kept it, but yeah, that's he straight up like seized it all. Like I mean, he paid them for it, but the prices were, I
set by
think
them.
kind of arbitrary. Yeah, he would wake up and tell like Morgenthau, he's like, seven's my lucky number, so we're gonna do 3 times 7, $21 an ounce, and this is like in diaries. This is I'm not making this up. It's like it's sort of interesting. In a way, it amazes me that the New Deal did not end up maybe more like the 5-year plan. Yes, it didn't. There's like, I think people are coming around to admitting that it didn't actually get America out of the Depression. World War II did, but I'm amazed it wasn't, I guess, more catastrophic than it was. Just, I don't know why that is. I guess it's maybe just I don't know, but there was a lot of
Because
stuff that's almost like Stalinist in the New Deal where it's just completely arbitrary that has no like a lot of I like 7, it's my lucky number. Like stuff like that is all
we'll
over it.
buy we'll buy a bunch of pigs, from the farmers, and we'll make them sell them to us. Then we'll kill them all, and we'll burn their
Yeah.
carcasses, or we'll
Henry
buy a bunch of
Wallace was
shoes.
Henry Wallace was really big on I think the livestock and the grain destroying. Like just the we talked about him last. He's in this book again too.
We'll talk about them in a
Such a
minute.
if you're in more
That
than
son of
one
a bitch.
if you're in more than one episode on this show, like you're probably an asshole. I mean, I'm sorry to say,
Or
it's
awesome,
just
but Wallace
yeah,
was definitely not awesome. So what I don't really understand is, so you had expropriation of gold going on in the Soviet Union, so they could send it to America. You had expropriation of gold going on in America. What the hell were they doing with all this gold? Was it just, if you're connected to the administration, you can have a bunch of gold, and then when eventually we'll release the price and let people own it again, you'll just become a multi millionaire or whatever? Like what was America doing with all this gold?
I don't know, truth be told. That's a good question. I don't know enough about like that part of FDR's administration. Um, I know that, they talk about how some of the gold from the USSR was like then they sent some there, from like melted down church stuff, and it was basically ending up in Fort Knox and stuff, but as far as like what they actually did with it, that I don't have the slightest idea. Because Stalin stole all of Spain's gold during the Spanish Civil War. He like got
Yes.
them to send their whole treasury, like 35 tons of gold ingots, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'll just
We're
hold."
here, it'll be safe here. Don't worry about it. You got a
Yeah,
lot of problems going. America did the
but
same thing, I believe, with Britain, right, and or with France,
oh,
around
that's
World
right.
War
Didn't
II.
they send it to like Newfoundland or something when they were like during the Battle of Britain, they were worried about it getting invaded or something. I
Yeah,
think I've heard this story.
I believe so. Well, I think like a lot of it is in Fort Knox now. Trust us, it's safe there.
Yeah,
Don't
odd job's not going to get to it.
yeah, 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 yeah. You can assume it's there. You can trust us. What do
But I don't know what
you
they
don't
did with
trust?
the goal. I should have looked like before, we did the show, but that's a really interesting question because I have no idea, truth be told.
So
I'm
these
sure it went
guys,
towards something good, like probably like, charities and stuff.
um, Jeffersonian
Yeah,
Democrats all over the
yep,
world benefited
that's
from
right.
this gold.
Oh yeah.
um, so the question, I guess, okay, so these people, the ones that did not get killed right away, go to the gulag, and
Yeah.
most of them die within a couple of years of malnutrition. There's an excellent book called Camp Boss. I mean, it's actually a terrible book. It's this guy's memoirs of how he, in 1940, I think, graduated
Yeah.
from engineering school, and the NKVD was like, "Cool, you're gonna come work for us." He was like, "Okay," and they're like, "Cool, so you're gonna go work in this great place we got up north, and you're gonna run a prison camp." This guy's like, "All right." He shows up there and he's like, "What the fuck is this?" And it's just a prison camp, but there's no buildings, there's no nothing, and it's a bunch of like convicts, and they're just like sleeping on the snow, and it's November. And he's like, they're like, "Yeah, listen, dude, I don't know, the ship that was supposed to like bring these people food, I don't know, something happened. We don't have any food." And so this dude starts off his career by like having a meeting with everybody, the convicts and the staff and being like, okay, guys, we got a quota to make, but you're not going to be able to make the quota if you're all dead, and you're all going to be dead soon. So I am going to bullshit the quota. You are going to spend the next like 2 weeks building dugouts for everybody with a stove in every one of them, and then preparing wood so that you don't freeze. And then we'll fill the quota because we'll work like 3 times hard. And they do all this, and then like it comes out that he did this, and then he has like a party town hall meeting. He's like, guys, listen, can't fulfill a quota. These guys are dead. These guys can't live if they're living in the snow. Yeah, I did it, and everybody's like, all right. And then he runs like prison camps for like 3 or 4 years, and so it's this guy's memoirs when he's in 90 years old or whatever. Anyway,
I'll have to check that out.
so this guy was exceptional because most people in that
Well,
situation are like, well, I guess you're all just gonna die then.
I
Eat
thought,
it.
well, there's one memoir of a guy who was like a gulag enforcer, and I have not read this memoir, but I think it was called I don't remember the name of it, but he would like chase people around with like a baseball bat or an iron bar and beat them if they didn't work hard enough. And it's weird to me, and I guess maybe it's cathartic and you're old, but it's weird people who do stuff
Admit
like
this.
that and they just, yeah, exactly. Like I would not want to have that written down anywhere that I was doing anything like that. But you know, in the terror thing too, like there was a thing in that book that where they talked to the people who were doing the executions because they were doing, like they recognized, the Catton or Caton or massacre as being the same thing, but they would talk about the NKVD guys who would have to do that stuff. They would get paid extra and they would get them drunk, like after they would just ply them with vodka and just they would just drink themselves into a stupor after doing all this stuff. But you kind of get the impression when you read this stuff that the guards, I'm sure they got hardened quickly, but you it seems like it sort of messed with them too. Like when this ended, the people, maybe not this guy seems more decent than most, but a lot of these guys became alcoholics.
Yeah,
You
many of them
know,
died young. The ones that didn't make it to, um, some of them got executed in the 50s
yeah,
for what they did after Stalin, but many of them didn't make it that far because they just drank themselves to death. And
yeah,
if you look at like Nazi atrocities, they started off mass murdering people on the Eastern Front very pretty much in the first month. The guys they had doing it were in part Einsatzgruppen, but
yeah,
also a lot of these guys were just nugs. They were like, some reserve police battalion
yeah.
from um, from Hamburg or whatever. These guys were just working class nugs, and they like lost their marbles. So then they were like, okay, let's have the Untermenschen do it, and they had the Travniki men who were a bunch of basically Belarusian and Ukrainian scumbags. But even those guys couldn't, do it like for too long, and they were having issues. Even the senior SS guys that showed up, I think Himmler like went to a mass execution.
He
Yeah,
vomited. Because
right.
well, I've heard that, I don't know, like all all that if all of them were the same because I don't know about each, like each camp, but I've heard that at some of those camps, like, alcoholism and like promiscuity, like the females and the male officers, right, there was sort of this almost just like hopelessness. Like
Nihilist,
it's just, yeah, it's so horrible. It's just like, okay,
pure
I'm just gonna
nihilism.
I'm just gonna bang everyone and just drink like a fifth of booze a day type thing. And
Sure.
it's just interesting how like even in this system, like it sort of shaves you down, but there's still like this guttural, visceral, like this is horrible reaction to what you're like. There's like a part of you that doesn't ever come to terms with it, I guess I would say.
Yeah,
Unless you're
it's the human soul.
I mean, even that guy Yezov, Yagoda's replacement, they talked a little bit
Yezhov,
about
Yezhov,
him.
yeah.
Yezhov, yeah, he was they called him the dwarf, and he just seems like a monster. But when Beria he quit because he knew Beria was eventually gonna, kill him, and then Beria and he just became like as soon as he quit, he just became like a hardcore drunkard. Like he knew, and these people too, they've seen all this death, but they like cry when it's their time to be executed because they know how. So it's like they're not these automatons. That's what, in a way, that makes it more depraved because it's like if you had no feelings and you did this, okay, you're just like an animal. But if you're if you're crying and shrieking and stuff when you're getting, it tells me that you were just willing, like how bad this is. You know what I mean? Like it's,
Sure.
I guess maybe I'm just pampered. I have trouble. wrapping my head around like the psychology of how it would be like to live in this system, even as a non-inmate, just as a person of authority for any length of time.
Well, I mean, it's not just a 20th century thing. I mean, for instance, the Romans had slave markets everywhere.
Yeah.
And a lot of these slaves would go to places that were just, mines and be worked to death
Yeah.
on an industrial scale. And this is how the
In
Roman Empire functioned.
in Spain, there was like I forget, maybe it was in Rubicon where they talk about like the smoke that came up from the smelters and stuff was so putrid that birds would just die. I don't know if that's true, but I have no doubt. I've seen Athenian mines. Like it's pretty. It would not be a micro dirty job that I'd want to do personally. But
The Athenian
maybe
silver mines, yes, yes,
maybe
very.
Mike Rowe would do it. I don't know.
um,
But I didn't mean to digress. I that made an impact. Like it's just crazy, like how just it just ruins your soul to even like live in these places, in my opinion. I mean, it's caustic.
of course, and it spreads because when you think about the basic attitude, like it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing, but once you have something like this in your society, it just spreads. Like everybody knows,
Yeah.
and everybody kind of knew. Like people say, well, your typical German didn't know about the Holocaust. It was a secret military project. But if you read Ernst von Salomon's Die Fragenbogen, the questionnaire, um, he mentions like people would see a train full of human beings with just like filth leaking out from under it, you
Yeah.
know, passing through. And these guys had the same thing only 8 years earlier in Russia. So the war happens. Some of these people, the kids are taken away from their parents and sent to orphanages, and some of them survive.
Some of the
Um,
kids, though, if you read Eugene Lyons, there is like probably hundreds of thousands of feral orphan children roaming the Russian
uh-huh.
countryside. He sees them everywhere, and their parents have been. We don't know what happened. They obviously are in a camp somewhere, or they're in a mass pit somewhere. But the kids just run around at railway stations. They form these feral gangs.
Hmm.
That was the thing that made the biggest impression on him, just the insane amount of. But yeah, the orphanages. I don't know if being a feral child gang would be better than a Russian orphanage or worse, but
Well, some of these guys survive and actually go on. They were, young enough not to be killed or imprisoned, but old enough to, when the war happened, to fight in the war, and then
yeah.
so on and so forth. About the orphanages, this is an interesting digression. I read a great book in Russian that was published a few years ago by a guy who was a Russian. I think he was a producer. But
Hmm.
this guy's story was like this. His father was executed. His father was Polish and his mother was Polish as well. But they were living in Russia and they had the Polish operation where the NKVD went and were like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a Polish name, get him.
Yep.
Um, I think in 30, 37, 38. And this guy got sent off to an orphanage and he was like three. No, he wasn't three. He was like maybe 4 years old or something like that.
Right.
He got sent off to an orphanage. He survived. The war started. He survived the war and he kept running away. And eventually he ran away and he traveled from his orphanage. He started making his way back from the Eastern Soviet Union by hopping trains, and like he was living with people in the forest, and he was living
Yeah.
with professional criminals, and he was living with these orphans and stuff, and like his whole adventure, like this kid was like maybe I think like 9 or something like that when he escaped, and then eventually around 1948, he got all the way to the Baltics. He got caught. He was a professional criminal at this point. Um, he spent a few years in jail, and then he turned 18 or something like that. And then they called him back to Moscow, and they're like, "Hey, here's your mom, and you're free to go now. Don't tell anybody what happened here."
Jesus.
And so this book is in Russian. I don't think a translation exists in English. ChatGPT would probably be a great use case for this. Um,
Yeah.
and this guy, he's like, well, I guess I, got to live somehow. And he applies to film school and he becomes like a filmmaker. And he spends the next 4 decades or 5 decades making Russian movies to make it very big. Um, right, and he writes about this world of like feral orphans, professional criminals, just plain Russians like getting along, veterans that like talk about the trains coming back after the war, and then at every train they stop and they drop off a guy with like no legs and no arms, and all the women are like crying, like, "Oh, he finally came back." They're like, drag him off. They're like, "You got an arm, that's good enough for me." Because most of the women, their husbands don't come back
Yeah.
without arms, without nothing. Incredible book. Um,
Yeah, that's awesome. I've never heard of that. Uh, One thing before I forget, I wanted to say too about the criminals. You know, in the I haven't read the Herman autobiography yet, but if you read Varlam Shalamov, who wrote this is one of the saddest, most horrible books I've ever read, but it's just so beautiful. It's like Solzhenitsyn's great, but Shalamov to me is just even better. But he wrote this series of stories called Kalima Tales, and it's okay. It's first of all, it's sort of like it's very clear that, he added some literary flair. It's like that guy, that Polish guy, Ryszard Kapuscinski, who goes to war zones, and all the people sound like Kapuscinski. But I believe that, it's basically, I think that it's like poetry, not prose type thing. But for Kalima Tales, he was a political prisoner, and they mention him in the book. But he goes to the Kalima in the Arctic, the same way that Victor Herman did, and Thomas Scovio. And these like organized criminals and criminals would go to these gulags too, but they were held in higher esteem than some random guy who made an offhand remark about Lenin. They paid off the guards. On the ships to Magadan, they would like break through, they would rape the female prisoners. They would break through the partition and in the cargo hold. But he's there, he would just see them. If you were weak there, in addition to getting beaten by the guards, you'd get beaten by these criminals. And Victor Herman was so tough that he beat multiple assailants up. They beat him up too, but he got beaten by the NKVD. So they respected him because he was a tough man. But Varlam Shalamov has all these horrific stories. He just released another one that I haven't read yet about the Russian mafia inside of these gulag camps. And this, like, think about this for a second. Shalamov was in the gulag for almost, I think, 17 years, and he hated these gangsters more than he hated the communists who put him in the gulag. Like, think about just how repellent these people must be. Like, that's pretty crazy, isn't it? It's a
um,
beautiful, maybe not, like,
you need to look at it from several different points of view. I've read and listened to Russian professional criminals talking about this stuff too.
yeah.
So Shalamov was what was this guy's background? He was an
He was a
intellectual.
lawyer. He was a lawyer, I think.
I think he was a doctor, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Maybe, maybe
He said
he was.
something, he made some comment in a letter about Lenin, and they just put it was an offhand, ridiculous remark, and they just put him in
No,
there.
no. Well, he was an actual communist. He was a committed communist. I think he was a Trotskyite or something like that. And they had
Right.
a group of guys who were like, "Well, this sucks," you know. Um, and I don't think I don't think, the really interesting thing about the communists is they would go, you know, after being tortured, after confessing, after getting their sentence, the ones that survived would go to the camps, and many of them remained communists, and they would have party meetings, even though they were no longer in a party, discussing right in the barracks, discussing like party politics and
Yeah.
issuing resolutions, and they would write letters, and if Comrade Stalin only knew how we were being treated.
Yeah.
So a lot of the contempt in which these people were held by the professional criminals was completely deserved
Yeah.
because they were like, listen, of course there's Trotskyite records, but me,
Yeah.
it's not fair. I'm a
Yeah.
passionate communist.
I don't think Shalamov. I always pronounce these names wrong. I said
Shalom,
Shalamov.
shalom, yeah.
Okay,
Shalom.
Shalamov. I'll start saying it that way. But he is very cynical about the whole thing, and again, it's hard to describe just like how awful that is, to where you think like, how could there even really be real organized? Like, these people have like nothing. They have like, oh, I have a pair of socks. How could there be enough like assets in there among these prisoners for there to be like a mafia to control? But there was. It's insane. And Yeah, what you're saying though, like there's a scene where this guy is in the infirmary and he just keeps strangling inmates and he goes to the infirmary, he would strangle an inmate with a towel and get another 25 years, but they wouldn't kill him because they didn't execute non-political prisoners at this point. So they'd give him another 25 years to his 700-year sentence. Then he would go back into Gen Pop, he'd go back to the infirmary for some excuse, he'd kill someone else because he liked the infirmary more. And there was this
Right.
intellectual he's about to kill, but it turns out there's a riot in the prison, and he says to the intellectual, "You're lucky. I was going to strangle you, but I need to get back to the prison. You soft intellectual boys don't understand what real men are up to." We're, and it's like one of the most crazy anecdotes in the story. But I guess that kind of speaks to the contempt you're talking about the criminals had for these people, like these, I didn't know they were having that's just really on another level of just delusion to still you're in the gulag and
If only
I talk
Comrade Stalin knew. We're
yeah
strong. We support the political stance of the Soviet Union against the racism of the Americans. We read about
yeah
it in the newspaper that we unwrapped from some machine parts they sent from America. Um,
well
you want to hear two funny things?
yeah go ahead.
The same exact thing was going on in the Nazi concentration camps during World War II, except for there, the 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 mafia was the professional criminals, and the communists, and they were
Oh
the capos, and these were the people that were doing all right in there. I mean, sometimes they get killed or whatever, but until they got killed, they were doing great. They get to kill people, they get to rob people, they get to do whatever they wanted. And also, in the Soviet system, the professional criminals were considered a socially close
yeah
element,
yes
meaning that they were closer to the proletarians than
yeah
these intellectual wreckers and
yes
Trotskyites and so on. And so they would get all kinds of
they can be reformed. We gave that guy 700 years. He's going to have a lot of time in his 700-year sentence to think about it, and he's probably going to get a GED, and he's going to come out, and he's going to be like, he's going to be great. I mean, it's
he's
just going
gonna
to be
get into music once the
yeah
Innocence Project releases him.
yeah
He's going to have socially conscious music sponsored by USAID.
yeah
Um, he's actually a Jeffersonian Democrat.
hmm
All right, fine, sorry. So the other thing is there's another memoir in Russian, which I don't think has been translated, will ever be translated to English, by a guy named Bistrolyotov, who was a Russian aristocrat.
yeah
Well, he was the illegitimate son of a Russian aristocrat who took care of him. His mother was a revolutionary type lady, and he fled to the West in 1919. The whole like story of like his life in the Civil War and like how he survived there and how they were like operating a ship. He was like a tender on a ship that was going from Istanbul to like Western Turkey and evacuating these Greeks and whatever and taking everything off them and then like just beating back the people they couldn't take on, like, with oars, and they would drown because the Turkish army was, on the coast and would just, slaughter these people. Um,
This is during the time where like you have Smyrna getting ethnically cleansed and
yes, 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 yes,
okay,
yes,
well,
yes.
okay, right.
So this guy goes and makes it to Istanbul, and then he um, eventually, he's learning in Czechoslovakia, and he volunteers to be an agent for the OGPU, and becomes a non-official cover officer and illegal all over Europe, and he's one of their best recruiters of sources. And then he never joins the Communist Party, which is what saves him, because eventually in 1936 he goes back to the USSR, or he gets recalled or whatever, and then he gets some bullshit job in the archives. And then in 1937 they arrest this guy and torture a confession out of him and send him off. They killed everybody else, but because this guy was not a party member, they just gave him 25 years, and then he spends the next 25 years in the prison camps, and then gets out and becomes because this guy spoke a bunch of languages fluently, and he was a great writer, artist. He got a degree in medicine and he got a degree in law, and
Yeah,
so he works as a consultant for the next several decades and writes this memoir in the 90s. He's very old. um, and he writes about the camps. He writes about the professional criminals.
yeah.
with
What is it
less
called?
hate.
Vori e Zacconi, or there's
What is Zakoni of
Vora
Zakonia?
Zacconi,
He,
brothers and thieves and brothers in thievery or something like that. Is that
thieves.
thieves thieves in
In
law?
Yeah, but not quite because the linguistic connotation of vor is not just the guy that steals stuff. Um, it's more than that. It's a professional criminal. Uh, okay, so without going any further on that digression, there's a lot of fascinating literature from the period in Russian. Um,
Yeah, that's
but these
awesome. I would.
people, yeah,
No, I just wish like, yeah, if I could, I found some stuff that's not that's in weird files like old, like I was telling you about the Charles Crane thing I found, but it's
mhm.
not formatted well. But I'm wondering if, yeah, if that's a perfect thing for Chat GPT to just
This is a
copy and
great use
paste that.
case.
Yes,
This is a
but I'd
great
be
use case
delighted to
for
read
AI.
these. Yeah.
So
But
maybe this will be a side project later on. I'd have to scan this
yeah,
if I can't find an online copy. So World War II happens. Things are very bad in the prison camps for a while. People are volunteered to go to the front just because you'll have something to eat there. Um, and something very interesting is discussed in this book as well. These ships, first of all, there's American Liberty ships that are going
they're
with
getting
land.
repaired in America. He's like, if it would be like if the
What
locomotives on the way to Auschwitz got repaired in Philadelphia and shipped back, like it's like disgraceful.
Well, so for a little bit of context, so there's a tremendous amount of shipping being built in America, and
Yeah.
some of it's going to Russia, bringing Lend-Lease stuff to Russia,
A lot
and
of it is going to Russia.
and some of these ships stay in Russia, and they leave them for the Russians, and the Russians use them in this massive industrial network of the prison camps to
Yeah,
ferry raw goods and to ferry convicts around. And some of them get sent back to America to get refurbished. And one of these
yeah.
ships got stuck on it got what do you call that in maritime terminology when a ship like hits
Scuttled? No,
no, it
grounded?
got
Gra
grounded. I don't know. It got
that might be
stuck,
an airplane. Yeah,
and so these guys and up in the northeast up by Kamchatka or whatever, and the crew's like, "Well, see ya, suckers!" And they close the holds and they leave, and all these guys are in the holds, and it's packed full of humans like sardines, and they just all suffocate in there, and then eventually they refloat this thing, float it back to Seattle, and
yeah,
they're like, "Hey, can you fix this thing for us?" And the Americans are just, like the whole thing stinks of death. Everybody in the shipyard knows exactly what this thing was being used for. There's also American ships that get stuck. The weather closes in or whatever. They're stuck for months unloading in Russian docks, and they're watching convicts unloading these ships and just, like dying of hunger right there, being executed, like stealing like flour that spills out of sacks and getting killed for it.
yeah,
All these guys went back to America, kind of like how the Germans from the Eastern Front would go back to Germany and be like, "Oh yeah, we just, murdered 10,000 people in there. What do you think about that, mom and dad and my uncle?" And everybody knows. So these guys, it's like if you didn't know about this stuff, it's because you really didn't want to know, and
Well,
America didn't want to know.
there's an interesting thing, and I was just thinking about what you said earlier. We were talking about, like Walter Duranty and just all these, people who are frankly just, I don't know, like like at the point where you're covering it up and you're like just parting there, you're an accessory after the fact in a lot of ways.
During the
But
fact,
yeah, yeah, you're not even accessory after, you're an accessory during the fact. But when you know who like Beatrice Webb is, the Fabians and stuff.
yes, yes,
So she was like the arch queen of, like, she was one of the most important leftists, in the 20s. He was just a huge aristocratic communist, they call it Fabian. It's the same, it's all the same, like, but it doesn't matter. When Malcolm Muggeridge, who was her son-in-law, I believe, Kitty Muggeridge was, I forget how he was close to her. He was like an in-law to her. I'd have to look at it again. But when he was going to go to the Soviet Union and report on it in the 20s, she said this to him. And this is a very genteel woman. And she said something like, just so you know, Malcolm, people often disappear in the Soviet Union. And the thing is, you're like, is that sounds like a very bad thing, but she continued to praise it. Like she knew about this stuff too, like in the 20s. I think that, like the book with the Davies and stuff, just talks about this. You talked about like the Germans and stuff, but I think it's sort of like maybe partially self-deception, sort of like they think they're like the Plato, the heroic lie, like this is a lie that yes, this is happening. But I think a lot more people, especially in the top echelons of like FDR's government, like they of course knew about all of this and they just didn't care because they were like, well, it is what it is. But this was not people are I've heard this is an argument I've heard people are like, well, I can see why you were a communist in the 20s. By the 40s or 50s you have no excuse, but even in the 20s I think that it's just sort of like you're high on this intellectual opium, and it's
There were
I
so
think
many
that
there were so many
yeah,
atrocities that happened during the Russian Civil War and afterwards that and this stuff was documented by people that fled the place.
yeah,
Millions of people fled, and many of them wrote books. But there's a certain mentality where the thing we're doing here, it's so wonderful. The cause is
yeah,
so noble. We're going to eliminate poverty and exploitation and sickness and suffering. We're going to build this beautiful utopia, but you have to be a hard nose about it, dude.
yeah,
It's like if you're fighting Nazis, you can't be a sissy about it. You're fighting absolute evil. If you're fighting communists, if like the CIA's like the MK Ultra people, if you're fighting communists, and these people are the worst thing in the world. I mean, they just want to nuke us and end civilization as we know it and cause, I don't know, 100 million people to die. You can't be a pansy, dude. And once you accept that framing, well, if I can't be like this much utopia is worth, me looking sideways like when a kid gets killed. Okay.
yeah,
Well, maybe this much utopia is worth me looking sideways when 1,000 people get killed. Well, maybe, once you start on that slippery slope, it's very hard to until it's your leg that's caught in the trap, and your buddy's
yes,
like, hey man, utopia. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Utopia, it's pretty nice. Pretty nice. I'm sorry about your whole like thing with the plastic shredder you're in. That's not
yeah,
nice. I wouldn't, but Utopia,
yeah.
and then some of these people wake up. Then, like, what was that fat guy, Whitaker Chambers?
Yeah,
Like,
would it? Oh, he's great. You know, um, Chambers is so interesting because he's basically a theater kid, and I it's such a strange thing with him because he comes off compared to someone like Alger Hiss, he comes off like a loser to the cool people. He's just like disheveled and stuff. But if you read his stuff, he's very sincere. Like there's not a point in there where when he joined the Communist Party, when he's like dealing with these people, I think he was dealing with Boris Baikov, that was the Russian guy. And I don't remember which podcast it was where this is probably a separate well, I'd like to talk at some point in the episode about Lawrence Duggan and Harry Dexter White and all these and James Forrestal and all these mysterious deaths that happened around the McCarthyist or maybe pre-McCarthyist era, because the point is that I think that the US government knew that the NKVD was assassinating people on American soil, but Chambers is fearful for his life. But he goes and I think he lives actually in like Daytona Beach for a while. He goes, but there's no point in there. He does when he's like betraying the US or whatever, or helping the CPU as it, he is always utterly sincere. And you get the impression from reading this book, which is a wonderful memoir, and it's one of the rare anti-communist ones that's still in print. I think it's by Regnery, but he never comes off as some of these people, like if you read about Andrei Vichinsky, who is the prosecutor for a lot of the show trials, you read about it. He was insecure about his like lineage. I think he was a Menshevik, so he was always trying to like suck up to Stalin because so when the party line changes, he changes. But for someone like Chambers, in a way, he's almost more of a true believer until he's not than some of these
sure,
sweating functionaries who are worried about what Stalin is going to like want. Stalin's going to have a dream like that this person betrayed him in a dream and he was a Czech. Oh, I went to Czechoslovakia like 2 years ago for, as the like for some trade delegation. So I better start denouncing the Czech. For Chambers, in my opinion, reading it, he seems like a sincere to the point where it's almost like perhaps naivete. It's
yeah,
hard to
yeah.
explain,
It's
but
it's a,
it's like
it's a little
that.
bit cringe almost a little bit.
Yeah, but it's like it's also like you have trouble. you're like, you're unbelievably naive, but I can't help but respect you a little bit. Where it's like
Sure.
when you left communism, you left because you had convictions, and when you were in it, you had. I think you thought you were doing the right thing, even if I think that's appalling. I don't know. Does that make sense? Or
That's absolutely true. There were people that were true believers and then became kind of disenchanted with the reality. But it's very hard. It takes a very pure soul in the way to do that, and and most of these people were not pure souls at all. So what happened? This kind of brings us to our next point. In the 1940s, in 1944, the guy that was supposed to be the next U.S. president, the U.S. vice president, Wallace.
we talked about this in our last.
We
Let's
talked
go
about
into it
some,
more.
but it's
Yeah,
in
let's
this
go
book
into it
too.
more.
It's
Yeah,
in this book
exactly.
too.
No, that's
Like
perfect. Yeah.
he goes to the tour the USSR, our greatest ally. We're whoop de whoop. We're beating up the Nazis and the evil Axis together. Well, except for Japan, but whatever. And let's get a tour and extensive media coverage. And he has a translator who's Owen Lattimore, who we discussed last time, who's a
Yep.
big commie spy,
Good old
a
Owen
real creep.
Lattimore.
I studied under somebody that she studied under somebody that was condemned personally by Owen Lattimore. Um,
At a
oh, man.
CPUSA thing?
No, he was condemned for being a Nazi collaborator. He was a scholar of Central Asia,
Hmm.
Turkic and Mongolic studies. His name was Nicholas Poppe, and he was an ethnic German from the USSR. And apparently, probably rightfully,
You can't trust those Volga Germans. They're all
well,
wreckers and collaborators.
well,
You
he
got to be
got he
careful.
got repressed a little bit, and the way that he responded to it was that when the USSR was invaded, he joined the Nazis. He was in the South at the time, and I think was actually a translator slash consultant for the Einsatzgruppe that was down there. So this guy was a creep
Damn.
too. My teacher, Professor Ilse Sertautis in the University of Washington, was a very nice lady. She was in her 90s at this point. She had an incredible grasp on Central Asian and Turkic studies. I learned a lot from her. Very, very
Owen
nice lady.
Lattimore's
But
Owen
Lattimore
Lattimore's
condemned this
Central
guy.
Asian Owen Lattimore, just as an aside, Owen Lattimore's Central Asian policy was basically just like the USSR should be able to annex whatever parts of Central Asia that it wants. Like,
Comrade
and
Stalin will take care of it all.
yeah.
So Lattimore is this guy Wallace's personal translator, and Wallace goes. He's like, "Well, shucks, folks, what's this gulag?" They've been talking like, "Oh, we'd love to show it to you. It's
And there
this
was a
wonderful
National
place."
Geographic photographer with him. There was this a
Oh
National
yeah, yeah.
Geographic these pictures.
Well, we'd love to
Yeah.
show it to you. It's a place where now every country has criminals, but our criminals get reformed through
Yep.
productive labor, and we'll take you here and look how happy and well fed they are. They're doing gymnastics.
Yep.
Here, the prisoners grow oranges in the Arctic Circle. It was all like NKVD guards that had, just
Yeah.
like swished into prisoner uniforms and were like, "Yeah, I can do flips on the monkey bar, sure, whatever." I love growing oranges in the Arctic Circle, and this asshole. I mean, it's 1944, so America's been like for a decade now. The highest echelons of American government have been like getting, the real deal from people like Lloyd Henderson or whatever in
Yeah.
Moscow.
I actually look for his memoir. It's like out of print. I'm gonna find it eventually on archive or something. But yeah, that guy was in there a lot. He's great.
That's a separate spin. Well, I'm not a huge Henderson fan. He was one of these State Department Arabists that was like, Jews are
Ah,
communists and the Middle East, is
yeah.
Arab, and we should, the oil is where the Arabs are, and we should. So I'm not a huge Henderson fan,
Okay.
whatever. He hated communists. I don't like communists either. And he was right about the communists, of course.
Yeah.
So this guy, like, there's no excuse. This guy's running
Yeah.
around and he's like he's singing the praises of the communist gulag while the gulag is killing millions of people or whatever.
And the
And
Gulag prisoners
and
saw them set up this beautiful Potemkin village, and they
yes,
were just like, they're just like, wait a second, maybe the U.S. is about to win, and then the U.S. just pulled the rug, and they're like, oh, it's just a propaganda tour. Like, this sucks. No,
not only that, at this time there's still like thousands of Americans that are stuck in this hell
yeah,
system, and some of them not just these guys, these poor schnooks that came during the 30s, but also American prisoners of war
yeah. There's
that.
pilots who accidentally crash landed in Russia. They got put in the gulags, and FDR's like, can you let them out? They're like, well, no, you
And
know,
he's like, okay, right.
yeah,
Um, U.S. POWs that were quote unquote liberated by the Soviets. And again, there's like not a ton of rhyme or reason to them. Maybe they thought, hey, this guy's kind of interesting. Let's, and then once he's in there, you're not going to let him out.
I think
Um,
it's like they were worried. It seems like Stalin was worried about ideological contamination because he put a lot of the Germans who had, or the Russians who had invaded Western Europe, like Germany, he put them in the gulags for like various crimes. But I think he was worried about them bringing like these sort of ideological bacilli, like, hey, they have toilets in Germany, we have a hole in the ground, and he didn't want that. I could be wrong.
uh,
I don't know if
there was
that's
such a
true.
tremendous amount of Soviet servicemen involved in the occupation of Europe, of Germany and Czechoslovakia, and, in Austria and Yugoslavia. I think a small percentage of them went to the camps. But what did happen was a lot of the POWs got, the Soviet POWs got liberated, and then there was an investigation. They were like, okay, well, actually, while you were a POW, you did not comport yourself in the proper way,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
many of those guys did. They joined Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army. Many of them because the alternative was just being starved to death,
right.
um, or something equally horrible. And so these guys got sent to the camps, and many of them were in there with Ukrainian collaborators and all kinds of stuff. Bistrolyotov has a lot of a long section on this. Um,
I didn't mean to digress. I know you were talking about Wallace. I just wanted to, or you
yeah.
were talking about the Great Gulag Tour of 44.
So
You just,
while all these Americans are in there, and the war ends, and the Americans are still there,
yeah,
nobody lets them go.
right.
Eventually, in the 50s, after Stalin dies, many of them get amnestied.
Well, they
Or
get a pardon where they'll say like you can move to the area around that. You can't live in Moscow, and it's really horrifying because it seems like from some of these people, like they would be like, I was too scared to cross the street. I'd never done anything without authorization at this. So like, and then they, I don't know, like it was a weird thing because they expected to be rearrested at any minute, I guess is
yeah, they were getting scared. I mean, you
but
think
they
about
were
the
broken.
odds, the odds that like how many people they saw die around them
Yeah,
for at this point a decade and a half. From 1937 to 1952, that's 15 years.
yeah.
And some of them were in there before that, and they survived miraculously. I mean, Herman survived at one point. The way he survived, and I
Someone
remember
brought him
this.
food. He was in the mud.
No,
He was like, oh, go ahead, go
no,
ahead. I'm sorry.
no. He figured out that like he could catch rats in the camp shithouse and eat them
Oh, yeah,
raw,
that's right. That's right. That,
and that's how
yeah.
he survived. And everybody else died.
Well, but
Everybody else died.
there was a thing, and again, it's so fascinating. The Herman, and I'm sorry I have not. I know I told you I was going to read it after, I should have read the Coming Out of the Ice. This probably would have been a better session. So I'm sorry I didn't read that before, but I do have a copy. I'm going to read it. But in the book, it talks about there was a thing, and it's sort of like they told him to load a bunch of lumber into a train car, I think, but he left gaps. Like in other words, like fill it all the way up. But he did, but he left gaps, so it looked like it was full, and they found out about his trickery. So I think they like beat him just basically to death and left him in the mud. But one of the other inmates took pity on him and gave him some of his food. There's a couple in all these things, whether it's Shalamov or Herman or Segovio, there's always these things where like they get snatched from the jaws of death because of some like
Divine
just
intervention.
fate. Yeah. And Segovia was an artist, so the inmates were like, well, he's an artist, he can draw us, he can do the sketches. I tried to look up some of the pictures of that Segovio did, and I guess like if you were an intellectual, even the mafia people, if you were a good storyteller, there is a value to that because that seems like that's the one way an intellectual would be valuable to these like um these like Russian mafia people or proto-Russian mafia people where you can tell a good story or you can do something cool like you're an artist like okay you can paint signs for the camp or you can like you have to be useful in a way that there's a scene in what is it? The Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by
Hmm.
Solzhenitsyn. I read this one. I think I read it in like college for a class where there was a guy that came in and he was just always mooching off the people. He was a new arrival, and Solzhenitsyn's basically like, this guy's not going to live. He doesn't have any skills. He can't like he can't darn your socks. He can't do anything. He can't like just use random spices found around. Like I've heard in Mao's China, people from the outhouses would take fucking salt. I'm sorry for swearing on your podcast, by the way. I apologize.
That's
You
okay.
bleep that out. But they would scrape, like when you urinate, there's salt left behind. Like the people in the north in Siberia, when they urinate in the snow, um the
Deer,
people in the taiga, they will go.
reindeer coming.
Yeah, they have to push the reindeer away. So there's salt that's left behind. So I read a thing on Mao's China when someone was in the equivalent camp, and they would scrape the salt off the walls and eat it for nourishment. But you have to have a side hustle like that. Like the North Korean, you talked about rats. I read a North Korean one. I think it was that aquariums of PO. But the guy found like they were catching rats. He was basically like a rat harvester. And if you don't have a hustle like that, you're just going to die. So Segovia was an artist. Herman was tough, but they still shouldn't have been alive just based on the odds, but they managed to pull through because they had something like extra. Like
Yes,
if you put me in the camp, like I would probably not last like a winter, basically, if that. And
sure. So these guys had somehow pulled through, and now they were in the Soviet Union in the 1950s,
yeah,
which was no party in and of itself. Um, the POWs, by the way, and the ones from the Korean War
yeah,
that have been captured, like
I
never
didn't know
got
about
to live.
this. Yeah, and that's the thing. That's what really is appalling because at this point, it's like the US still didn't want to go to bat for them. Like they were still, in the 40s, they're like, we don't want to upset our ally Stalin, even though we're funding his whole war effort. You know, do you remember that scene? I've heard this recounted a few times. I've not read Bullitt's memoirs, but I'm not a William Bullitt fan. For the viewers, he's the ambassador that was before Joseph Davies, so he's maybe a little less repulsive than Joseph Davies, but only like this much. But at this point, he's been, to his credit, by like I think 36, he's like, these people are animals. They're just complete monsters. And Roosevelt somehow still likes him because that was a death sentence to be anti-Russian. But he tells Roosevelt, he's like, Stalin's just gonna like play you. He's not actually gonna be your vassal, and he's not gonna help you bring world peace. He's a gangster. He's a Georgian bandit. And Roosevelt's like, I don't believe that. I think he gave his word of honor. And Bullitt said something like, "This is not the Duke of Norfolk here. This is not like a garden party. We're not in like some summer estate in Northumbria or something for like looking at each other's ponies. This is like a total scumbag. He's like betrayed his close. He doesn't have any friends. Like he's not going to listen. When Roosevelt was going to Yalta and Stalin was like saying stuff in Russian. Roosevelt's like, let's go here, and Stalin's like, well, some of us will walk and some of us will ride. And his translator's like, should I translate that? And Stalin's like, niet. That's in the book. Like the,
It
this book,
depends. Do you want to go to Magadan or not?
yeah, like, but this book is just a great summary of all the stuff. But I guess the only point I wanted to just make about the what was I talking about? Bullet and stuff, but just that it's weird how the U.S. State Department, even into the 50s, when this relationship could no longer be,
Even
they
in the
could no longer be
60s.
friendly. Yeah, they were still like, let's not rock the boat. And it's like, what are you talking? Like the
Well, but do you know how much American industry was still in the Soviet Union at that point? I mean, those
no,
four
tell me.
plants, those four plants. So there's an interesting episode in Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony
Yeah,
Sutton,
yeah.
where American pilots are flying over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and
Wait,
they're
wait, wait,
sending
wait, wait,
reports
wait.
back. They go,
Well, the Sutton was the one about the 19. I've read the Sutton one. Are you talking about the Richard Spence one? I haven't read the
no,
Richard
no,
Spence one.
the Sutton one, and they're sending reports
I don't
back, and they're
remember
going,
this.
"Hey, there's American force down there." Like, what do you mean? They're driving four trucks. Those are four trucks down there,
Wait,
and these
oh wait, I'm
guys are like,
sorry. You
"Yes,
you said Ho Chi Minh Trail though.
Ho Chi Minh Trail." So they go, "Yeah, those four trucks are being produced in the Soviet Union under license by four plants
Oh,
in
okay,
the
okay.
1960s and shipped to North Vietnam, and they're
I
paying their
understand now.
license fees." And the Kamaz, the Kamaz automotive factory, which is basically an automotive city, was built in the 60s by a conglomerate of Western companies, um, French and Italian, but mostly American. And so there was a tremendous amount of industrial capacity and being pumped into the Soviet Union, money coming out of the Soviet Union to Western corporations. Even then, there was the bearings for the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the multiple reentry warheads, which
Yeah.
allows like one missile to hit like six different targets or whatever with nukes. Those bearings were made by Bryant Precision Grinder, which is a company out of, I believe, upstate New York, in the 1970s. There were a couple of hundred of these grinders in the world. The Soviets wanted to buy some. They applied for an import license. The DoD said, like, "What are you, crazy? Like, there's only one thing that you use these bearings for,
Ugh.
grinders for, and that's MIRVs." Like, no.
Yeah.
And Henry Kissinger was like, "Yes, oh yes," and they were like, "Okay." So this collaboration went on. But the interesting thing is that even in the Vietnam War, there was a lot of evidence. Because here, like, how do we know that American POWs were being
I
held
was
in the Soviet
okay.
Union?
I was specifically going to talk about this because there's a fellow. So I read this very funny. This is a you don't have to read this. It's not probably not worth your time. It's a guy named George Packer who wrote about the Iraq War, the Assassin's Gate. He is just a very standard milquetoast, um, New York Times liberal person. But he wrote this book. I forget it's his memoir. It's about both sides of his family. His mother's side was George Huddleston, who was a populist in Birmingham, Alabama. His mother's side was Herbert Packer. Maybe it's the opposite. It doesn't matter. Basically, his mother's side was a populist Southerner, and his father's side was a New Deal Jewish guy. And his father, Herb Packer, who ended up dying of a heart attack in like 50s because of these like stupid libtard radicals at Sanford University. His father became in the administration of Sanford University. And he was an old leftist person. He wrote these very just weaselly books saying about Whittaker Chambers and stuff, saying like, oh well, there's no evidence for this, but they made him look balanced. But he became in the administration. And this is what's funny about the 60s is these college radicals thought they were fighting the man, but they were just fighting New Dealers who were a little long in the teeth. It's the same movement, but Herb Packer was the administration, and if you read like David Harris, Dreams Die Hard, or whatever, he's just a more irritating communist fighting the older New Deal communists who have already got these positions. But the student that was the biggest pain in the ass to Herb Packer was this guy named H. Bruce Franklin. Now, H. Bruce Franklin, I think, you can look him up, but he wrote a lot of stuff when he wasn't giving George Packer's dad a heart attack. And the book doesn't say it, but it's basically like this guy's college agitation killed his father. But H. Bruce Franklin wrote numerous books saying that the POWs in Vietnam, Rambo 2, and there's been a bunch of stuff. I've read modern books in the Vietnam War. I don't know what to make of it, but after reading this one, like Franklin was basically like, no, this is all just stupid Reagan or dumb propaganda. There's no POWs left in Vietnam. But what I was thinking after reading The Forsaken is like, in the same way that in the Korean War, which Stalin subsidized, the connection between um, Vietnam and Russia, the Cambodians, Pol Pot was basically China's patron, but the Vietnamese were Russia's patron. So in the same way that the Korean War, the Americans got shipped there and the government did nothing about it, for the Vietnam War, is it too much of a stretch to think that the Vietnamese were just shipping the POWs back to Russia? Because that's what
So,
they've
so,
done every time. And I,
so,
I don't
so
know, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go on a tangent. I
no, no,
apologize.
no, no. This isn't a tangent at all. So, like, how do we know that there were American POWs from World War II and the Korean War in the Soviet gulags? We know because the
The
Americans that got
Japanese saw them too.
the
The
Japanese
Japanese
saw them,
POWs saw them.
Japanese POWs saw them, and some of these Americans that got
Yeah.
released later and then eventually, decades later, made their way back to America, they saw them. And these guys were still dressed in their uniforms, with their uniforms just like rotting off or whatever,
Yeah.
and still waiting to be eventually rescued, which is heartbreaking. So, a similar thing happened. We have similar testimony, not by Americans, but by other people. Um,
including
of
native Russians, by the way.
yeah, of American POWs that had various valuable technical backgrounds and skills. So if you were a pilot or a navigator or an electronic weapons operator on a plane that got shot down over North Vietnam and you were of special interest,
Yeah.
the Russians might have just shipped you back there so that they could really get to know all this stuff. That you were a valuable intelligence source. So who
Well, some
knows?
of the
But
yeah,
there's
I'm
a
not
book called Bring the Boys Back Home by a journalistic couple, the last name of Stevenson, which was published in the 80s. And this book kind of goes down the rabbit hole of the whole POW MIA thing. A lot of it is bullshit, but some of it appears to be not bullshit.
yeah.
Okay, that some of these people got left behind when America pulled out, and purposefully so, and some of them got left behind in places like Laos and Cambodia, where who the hell knows
Yeah.
what was going on. But some of them got shipped up to Russia, and the U.S. didn't make too fine a point of it, of trying to look
Yeah.
for them.
Well, it's also weird because there is a valid point where, you know, I don't remember which book I read, but the author, who I don't think he's not, H. Bruce Franklin might be right, he might be wrong, but I would not trust, I would not trust him, but I would certainly also verify. There, the point is like they could be right, but one of the modern Vietnamese books, or on the Vietnam War rather, I read just the author said something like the Vietnamese authorities knew that a lot of these planes were shot down over the jungle, and the remains, there's a reason serial killers throw their bodies in the swamps and stuff. Like that's why Florida is such a good dumping ground because it gets eaten. But the point I'm making is that they're like, why do you Americans even care about some bones? Like, we're telling you he's dead. We don't have him. And the author thought that was a good, like, a totally valid thing. But from reading this book, I kind of did take the H. Bruce Franklin line. I was like, they're probably not there because they would have used them as a bargaining chip. But as you said, like, they had interest in American radar. They had, even if you had piloted an aircraft, the
Well,
guns, the aircraft guns that they used to shoot down these jets in like North Vietnam and stuff were sophisticated. They were like Russian made stuff. They would be very useful to capture someone alive who had this information, I
well,
would think.
think about the background of the people that were shooting down. Some of them were lieutenants. They were 20, 23 years old. Some of them were colonels, and they were in their
Yeah.
mid 30s. Some of them had worked on various top secret projects
Yeah.
uh, further in their career path. They've been out to Nevada and they've been out to all kinds of places. They knew all sorts of things about electronic warfare. They knew all sorts of things about the American global intelligence effort. They knew all sorts of things about uh, America's nuclear weaponry. They knew all sorts of things about
Yeah.
um, everything.
It
Everything.
could just be something innocuous, like how do your radio, like I knew a guy in the Air Force who had to do all these books on, like, he was just learning how to be an electrician and stuff, but they teach you practical skills. So even if you're on a like an aircraft or something, like it could be something innocuous like the sonar thing where they'll like they're like, how does this work? And just tell us whatever you
Sure,
know. Or they could
sure.
just like, imagine if they're like slapping you and they're like, what is going on in Roswell? Tell us the UFO blueprints. And you're just like,
Guys, that's all a joke. That's not, you know,
yeah, it's not real. It's just a thing to get boomer Trump supporters on Facebook. We that's how we identify them, and they're just like, I don't
uh,
believe you. All
uh,
right, I'm just kidding.
you're not going home until we find out about the UFOs. So I guess I'm not
Yeah,
going home. So some of these guys they get out, they get married. They speak better Russian than English at this point, and some of them come back home in the 50s and 60s. Some of them it takes as long as the mid 80s. Some of them never come home, and they die in the Soviet Union, and only their kids speak to Liadis. And this is and there, that's it. There's no coda. Some of these guys. One guy um, is mentioned in the book, and he's dating a girl named Sarah Berman in Moscow, and her
yeah,
husband is her dad. Sorry, is Matvey Berman, who runs all the gulags, and he goes. And this guy's like some nerdy Jewish kid from the States, and he's like, "Oh, by the by, yeah, my girlfriend's dad is this guy. He runs the concentration camps here." And then, of course, like Berman, gets purged, and then this guy gets I looked him up by name. He got arrested and got executed in I think 38 or something like that. And there's no and there's an article in the 1990s in some upstate New York paper because I guess his family's from there that goes, oh yeah, it turns out that a lot of Americans got killed in the Soviet Union 60 years ago. Haha, sucks to be you. Well,
Yeah.
his family's very sad, but at least they got closure now. There's no closure.
Yeah.
America is never like, at least with things like what was it called, Crimes of the Times. There was a little bit of America going, well, the New York Times going, well, yeah, I guess we kind of knew about the Holocaust, and we didn't really want to make any noise about it, so we just kind of shut it down. With this stuff, there's never any kind of mea culpa. There's never any kind of
No.
acknowledgement. There's never anything. It's just this thing. Basically, it does not exist, and if it existed, it wasn't significant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really bizarre to me because um in theory, a good way, there's always this thing plaguing the left where they're like, and correctly so, is like, well, you guys just sucked up to communism, and it's all like, again,
Hans, you think we're the baddies?
yeah, exactly. Like there's no, but once the Soviet Union fell, it would have been a great time to just air this like dirty laundry. But what's interesting about the book too, and I'm not an expert on contemporary Russia or anything, but it sounded like there was people, you know, the author of The Forsaken, like I don't think that he got any threats, but from what it sounds like, even in the Putin regime, and Putin was technically he wasn't part of the worst aspects of the USSR, but even during his regime, when people were looking up some of this stuff, they were getting threats, and I don't know how credible they were. Like for instance, okay, so my understanding of China, there's a fellow, and it might be like, um just worth a discussion in the future. There's a fellow named Frank Decatur who wrote a trilogy on Mao, starting, with like 49, ending in his death in 76. And the first book I read on this is Mao's Great Famine. This is actually what inspired me in a lot of ways. Just read. This is how I learned about Who Lost China, not directly from this, but this guy somehow managed to get into the archives and find out like these death counts. Like, I don't know how he did it, but his research feels very credible. I think he puts the Great Leap Forward, that famine, at 47 million. And there's certainly been people, they don't talk about this in China. They ban books on this. Like, even though I think a lot of people are sort of horrified by it, but they're like, okay, this is the regime. This is like me bad mouthing the founding fathers. Maybe not quite like that, but they just
If
do not.
if you could get taken away and
Yeah,
have horrible things happen to you for talking shit about Thomas Jefferson. I had an
right.
English
But
professor in college that he was Chinese, and we could talk about Goethe or anything else. Boy, I brought up like Mao and the Great Leap Forward, and he was just like, "What? In
yeah, that's all for
Seattle?"
today.
I'm
Yeah.
like, "You're in Seattle, one on one
The,
during office hours.
but
Not
okay,
time to talk about it. 30 something years old, dude,
yeah,
in the
but
2000s."
there's
Sorry.
still no. I just want to point out that, like, okay, in some way you can see how, like, we can't, maybe this FDR stuff is verboten because we're still living in the New Deal, and how, like, the China, okay, they're still living in Mao's China. Like, there's never been a full refutation, but the USSR collapsed, and these are things that happen to foreigners. You could, but it's weird to me how this is just not. There still seems to be, this book was written in 2008, I believe, but it's weird how there's still this sort of cloud of haze on it when it seems like it would be relatively, well, not right now with the war going on, but it would be relatively politically innocuous in the same way Americans would be like, yeah, some of the stuff we did with the Native
Smallpox
Americans.
blankets, not nice.
Yeah, so it's weird how the regime literally collapsed and a new one formed, and there's some continuity, but it seems like this should be like just for the families of the people that were, if that makes sense to you. I mean,
There was
would
a
you agree with
movie.
that?
I would. There's something I want to bring up. There was a
Yeah,
movie
yeah.
recently about Walter Duranty, and there was a
I
guy
haven't seen
that
it, but I know
Garrett,
about it.
right? Garrett something or other. This guy from Wales, a journalist from England, who, while
Yeah,
Duranty was running around and sleeping with these trafficked Russian aristocrat women and guzzling champagne and then going to these areas where people were eating their kids and going, "Oh, they're fine." So
Yeah.
this guy actually um, and got the Pulitzer for it, the highest
Yeah.
honor for a journalist. And this guy actually went there and he wrote several articles, I think, for like some Manchester newspaper, where he was like, "Yeah, there's mass cannibalism going on here, dude," and it's and then like it got swept under the rug. So there was a mainstream movie about this
I know
recently,
what
I
you're
think.
talking about.
You know
It
what I'm
has
talking
the I haven't seen it, but I know what you're I
about?
yeah.
I envy Rogan because he has Jamie. Uh, I'll be, I'll be my own Jamie. Walter Durante movie.
Well, it
Um,
makes the conversation more organic in a way. Like you're just, it's sort of like that Walter Ong, the oral culture. Like oral culture doesn't always get stuff right, but it feels like more, I guess, real, if that makes sense.
yes,
Sort of like, I mean,
Mr.
that's,
Jones. That's what
yeah,
it's called.
Mr. Jones. And Jones is a
Gareth
Welsh name,
Jones.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah, so this guy was Gareth Jones, and he went to Russia, and then and Eugene Lyon makes an appearance here.
Oh,
Um,
really? Who played him?
well, I don't know. I don't know. We have to look it up. Um,
That's,
but so he goes there and he's told like, hey, journalists can't go outside Moscow. Durante and Lyons are like, there's some stuff going on here that you
yeah.
might find a little weird. And so this guy like sneaks off and runs around the Ukraine and sees all the stuff and comes back and publishes stuff even through William Randolph Hearst. And then 2 years later, right, Jones goes and travels to Inner Mongolia with a fellow journalist who was a member of the Comintern, and then he's kidnapped by bandits and executed.
I can't
Sad.
believe it. I
You
can't
know, the,
believe it.
when you think about it, those bandits were like, you're not going to
Yeah, of
believe this either, Jefferson. Well, fine.
course. Yeah.
Jeffersonian Democrats, fine Inner
They just,
Mongolian bandits.
he was probably for the T tax if you think about it. Like he was probably for the Stamp Act, so it's like they kind of,
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
British. Yeah, right. Uh, right. Probably racist too. I'm sure he said some racist things at some
Yeah,
point.
yeah,
Um, we need to look up his early Twitter feed, Mr. Gareth
yeah,
Jones. So Durante, so there was this massive apparatus of just lies, and as you alluded to, like there wasn't a moment. In the Soviet Union, there were a few moments where they were like, we did some really terrible things.
yeah.
Of course, I personally was always against it, but we did some really terrible things. Khrushchev,
Sure.
and then in
The
the
speech.
90s and even in the 60s, and so on. There was never that in the West. In the West, as you alluded to, there were New Deal commies who basically raised the generation of the boomer commies who, raised the generation of the 1980s commies
Yeah,
who raised the current purple-haired freaks. And there was never a big There were like here bits and pieces like David Horowitz, if you ever read his
of
memoirs,
course. Oh my goodness. I love David Horowitz's memoirs, Radical Son. Yeah, it's great.
Radical Son, right? So where he was like, yeah, these Black Panthers that I flew cover for, they were
They
murdering
they
people
murdered
everywhere.
some of these naive lawyers. They paralyzed face and like yeah, they're monsters. They're sort of like Stalin, where it's like
Sorry,
like
sorry, you're breaking up here. Well, I mean, they did kill lawyers, but besides that, they did very bad things also.
yeah. Well, for this is something that I don't know. I'm actually working on an episode. I know that like it's been like a month now, but the Virginia Durr episode that without doing any spoilers, not that this is like a riveting Marvel movie or anything, but she wrote her memoir. She was involved in the civil rights movement. All of her friends are like CPUSA members or they're involved in the Cambridge Five or whatever. And then she's like in her memoir, she's outraged that she's being talked to by like Jim Eastland. Of course, Whitaker
Who was
Chamber.
Jim Eastland?
He was a Southern senator who was not for civil
Ah,
rights. He was
how dare you? How dare you investigate me? I met.
yeah. Well, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was a kid in New York City in the
Hmm.
90s, and I met old American commies, like walking my dog in the dog park in
Yeah.
Brooklyn.
That's
And
that's kind of awesome in a way. And not I don't like them, but I mean just that's cool that you got to talk to them though.
I did. And these people were in their 60s, and they were still sure. Like, so they were in their 60s, So how would that have made them in the 1950s, 40 years ago? They were in their 20s. Um, and they were sure, they were like the outrage that McCarthy, people got blacklisted, people were
It's
couldn't
all
work in Hollywood.
it's
Oy
all
vey.
stupid. They didn't actually, nobody ever,
Yeah, they had
it's
to write
funny,
under like Ring Lardner or whatever. They had
but
to write under a pseudonym.
you know
Ooh.
that we
In
were
the 50s, in the 50s,
we
they're killing millions of people. These
yeah,
assholes,
we
like
just spent this whole episode talking about the show trials and the Great Purge in the 30s, and like these people, there's no other country I can think of that if McCarthy was like even a 1,000th of Stalin, the only communist that I
we'd live
know
in a
of
much better world.
that died from McCarthyism was a man named William Remington, who was just this wasp of immaculate American genetic credentials who got knifed in prison. And he got knifed in prison because the guy, you can look it up, his name is William Remington. And the guy who knifed him in prison was literal an actual retard who had like a 60 IQ and was like, he a communist. I don't like a communist. I kill communists with a rock or a knife. And it wasn't even like McCarthy's like put him in the gulag. So like I guess if McCarthy had killed like every person who like voted for Henry Wallace and then multiplied that by like 20, so that's like a million, that's like 20 million people. That's probably a rough estimate of Stalin. You could draw a parity, but McCarthy was not even a real player. He was just this guy. I mean, these people just view him as this disgusting. We talked about this again. I mean, I'm not trying to
This this
reiterate, but
this hick this hick
yeah, they
retard.
viewed him as a peasant. Like there's a phrase she uses as common as pig tracks. This Southern aristocratic lady, Virginia Durr. I'm gonna get this episode released. I'm sorry I haven't, but I think that the reason I'm so fascinated by this woman is because if you want to understand um, the sort of mentality of the people in the New Deal government, like the people we're talking about who just turned a blind eye to it from the 30s and their role until the 60s, Virginia Foster Durr is a wonderful like snapshot of their beliefs and how they viewed McCarthy. And I think I don't agree with, she's a very pleasant, I think it's actually oral testimony that's been transcribed, but I think it's just fascinating. Like, that's why I read this stuff. This is how these people think. And
They had this attitude and still do of like, how dare you stinking peasants?
yeah,
Even like, how dare you? Who do you think you even are
yes,
to question? This is something that's funny because when you see Vance, who, okay, Vance had a rough childhood, but but Vance went to Yale, was a highly successful lawyer, worked with Peter Thiel, is very much like an elite person. Vance,
he's a very sharp fellow.
if you look at, well, it's not that he's just a sharp fellow that, like he was some kind of autodidact from Texas or whatever. No, like Vance, Vance has an elite background. The way these people talk about Vance on Twitter, it's exactly this. Like, how dare this
They just
fucking
sneer at him.
peasant talk to Mr. Zelensky disrespectfully? And this attitude is exactly like writ very large, is exactly why America has never had its moment of reckoning, because
Yeah,
the only people that are bringing this stuff up are, you know, either explicitly or by association, just stinking peasants. How dare you even question? People had to write their Hollywood blockbusters under a
yeah,
pseudonym. This is how much we suffered. I am an aristocrat and I suffered the indignity of having to smell a peasant's body odor. In the meantime, you're like, what's that over there? Oh, it's the big peasant body trash pile. That's where they smoke
yeah.
when they're dumped in.
Well,
You know,
just to speak of the Hollywood scripts, and this is like hilarious where they're like, oh, you know, so this is an anecdote in The Forsaken where FDR, I think it was FDR, maybe it was Harry Hopkins, who is also another weasel on two legs, but he's just like he gives the Mission to Moscow this piece of absolute just hagiography that a lot of the stuff that the Webs and stuff wrote about the Soviet Union, by the way, was for Western consumption. Like if you tried to do that with the peasants, they would blush. It was too stupid. Mission to Moscow is probably about that level, but he gave this guy, the guy from I guess Warner Brothers, like Jack Warner, he gave him this book and said it would really do well for American morale. They're attacking Uncle Joe, and the Americans need to understand that this is a good man. So can you make this? And he didn't read the book. He's just like, yes, I will make it. And you can look at clip. I have not seen the whole movie on YouTube. I think it is on there, but I've seen clips of it, and they actually take the stuff and they take the stuff as though the show trial stuff was actually real and these people were actually trying to,
Sorry, just a
subvert.
second.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just a
Yeah, yeah.
second. You're coming in a little bit broken. So he makes
Mission
this.
Mission to Moscow got
Mission,
made into a movie, and the guy apparently hadn't the studio executive like hadn't even read the book yet. And the book,
yeah, right on.
hang on. I actually have a copy of it right. I've got an old hardcover copy of it somewhere. Yeah, all right here. So this one, let's see when this was written. It's got some old. Let's see what year it was. If this was actually from the New Deal era, that would be, I, I don't know. Maybe that's like the same thing as having like a Nazi Luger or something. It's just it's very shameful in some ways, but
I
it's
just
it's still
appreciate
a
the
good.
history, man.
Yeah. No, no, I have so much. It doesn't say the printing date. Whatever. All right. I am sorry to bring it. This is a used copy I have, but I was looking for the actual date it was printed because if it was from the early 40s, I actually have a book by Conrad Hayden called Der Führer. He wrote about Hitler. This is before, World War II and stuff, and he followed him around. This is a fascinating book, but I have a copy of it from 1944. It's a hardcover book. It's pretty cool, like because he's obviously critical of him, but the UR blog, Yarvin was talking about how like the Nazi propaganda where they just talk about what Hitler was like before he did all these atrocities is extra fascinating because you can see a picture of him before. And I've read um the Stephen Roberts one. Uh there's a couple books about him, and it's kind of weird that, the Nazi regime in a lot of ways felt like the Soviet regime in the sense that there was like a lot of like stuff like clothing being made out of wood pulp and just weird, creepy things. Like it was not, like vitalism. There was a lot of like slop that was,
Oh
like
yeah,
if you read about Wreck, the Germans would have yellow eyes because their liver would be contaminated because they would eat this fake margarine. Like that guy Wreck was an aristocrat. He hated the Nazis. He viewed them like as just the same way that, maybe I don't know, maybe the way like these people that I'm talking about in America viewed McCarthy, but he viewed them as peasants that just
right.
usurped the German. But I don't know. I think that stuff's very interesting, and I didn't mean to go on a random tangent, but
Uh,
I'm
on
so
on that tangent, there's a guy named there was a guy named Solonovich, who him and his brother and his wife escaped the Soviet Union on skis. They escaped the Gulag.
really
Yeah, he was well. He
that's
was a
awesome.
he was a professional athlete, and they escaped the Gulag and skied themselves across to Finland. And then he spent the 30s basically being chased around by Soviet spies who were trying to kill him. I think
Yeah.
they killed his brother and his wife eventually. And
Oh,
he ended up hanging out in Nazi Germany and becoming a big fan of the Nazis. And then he managed to escape at the end of the war. And then, of course, he kind of tried to retcon himself as like, well, there were things about the Nazis. So he wrote a
yeah.
book in, I think he went to like Argentina or Uruguay. And his memoirs afterwards, right? That's atypical for a Nazi to go to South America. So he wasn't quite a Nazi. He was a monarchist. Let's say he was a reactionary. But his memoirs
It's sort of like
afterwards,
there's a lot of like right wing any port in a storm thing where
yeah,
like
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah
yeah. So he's writing about like the mess that was Nazi Germany. He's like, in 1941 when the Nazi army was like, well, we kind of got a lot riding on this one, folks. We probably want to try to get this get a W out of this one pretty soon. And the winter's closing in, and there's a big like fight because the Wehrmacht is like, okay, we actually have priority on this rolling stock because we got supplies going east and wounded guys going west, and like it's ours. And the Nazi Party guys are actually, no, we have priority because we have all our trophies for us and our buddies, and they need to make their way west back to Germany somehow. And the somehow is on these trains. So no, F you very much. These are our trains. They're having this fight in like November 1941. And like
yeah.
he's like, and this is just how Nazi Germany was. Like it was a constant shit show on
It
every
was
level.
chaotic. Yeah. No, I mean,
And there's another book I read where they're like, okay, it's 1941, 1942, 1943. Like we got all these shoes. And whether Jews, how intensely Jews are being murdered on any given month depends on which part of the Nazi bureaucracy takes priority. Because there's the part that's responsible for killing Jews, and their performance indicators are like amount of Jews killed. And then
And
there's the ones that are like the shoes that these Jews make, we're actually responsible for them. So we notice that these graphs, like number of shoes made by Jews versus Jews killed,
yeah,
they have an inverse correlation. And so
yeah,
they're fighting bureaucratically, and it's this like
yeah,
Obama state mess where it's not
yeah.
clear who's in
Well,
charge of what, who has priority.
all of these regime, like whether it's Mao or whether it's like the Reich or whether it's the USSR, they all had quotas for even stuff like murder. Like it's just an insane. The targets are super weird, and it's completely like you sort of look at this stuff and I know you've read Klemperer's diaries. I have not read his East German ones yet,
Me
but
neither.
he has no, but like his diaries are really depressing because the first one, his wife is just sick. He had a Jewish contractor that ripped him off, and like he was trying to get the money, and he went to the Nazis. And Nazis like, oh well, there's nothing, technically. Yeah, this Jew ripped you off, but you hired a Jew. What do you expect? I know you're a Jew too, but that's what they said. That's what they said, and like it's just weird. Like it's just weird. Like it's like the movie Brazil. It's like the movie Brazil, and that's
Sorry,
like
sorry.
what?
Hold on a sec. You're breaking up again. Right,
Oh,
right. It's this depressing like bureaucratic rigmarole, and macabre, macabre. How do you pronounce
macabre.
that? Like
Mac
it's bizarre and hideous, but funny also,
yeah.
right?
No,
So we were talking about like kind of
how,
the
how it's like
the
the movie Brazil, like for
yes,
these regimes, and it doesn't matter if they're fascist, New Deal, communist. There's a lot of like just an immense tragedy of like human life just being wasted for these frivolous reasons. But it's also there was a lot of people that wrote, like Shalamov, like there's a lot of dark humor. It almost reads like a very depraved version of Catch 22. But if you read about Nazi Germany, the same stuff happened. I mean, it was not, there's always infighting with these giant organizations. It's the same thing with the New Deal. If you read The Roosevelt Myth by John T. Flynn, you will just see insane, like third world country stuff you'd associate today with like Putin or like even like someone like Hugo Chavez happening in the Works Progress administration. Like these regimes are always just these kind of lumbering, I don't know, like buffoonish at times. I don't know if you
yes,
want to.
yes. That's definitely a big aspect that we should get into in subsequent podcasts. Is kind of the farcical nature of these big evil bureaucracies. Okay, well, we're right about at the 2 hour mark, so let's I think wrap it up. Um, so we talked about The Forsaken by Tim Tsouliadis, highly recommended book, ties
If
into
you
a
if you
lot
have
of
not
stuff we
read
discussed.
if you have not read anything about like if you're interested in just if you're kind of like, okay, I don't have time to read all these memoirs and all this stuff, but I want to understand the Soviet Union and just what it was like living there. And this is a very wonderful in like it covers not only this unknown chapter of the POWs and these Americans that were just left to rot, but it covers the broad strokes too. This is a fine introductory like text to read on it, and it's well written. And I can tell you that I've read a lot of the other stuff like around this, and this is a wonderful recommendation. So thank you for Baruch for recommending it to me because this is a great discussion. Like I love talking about, this period in history.
The thing that makes it so amazing also is that it kind of comes at it from an American perspective,
Yeah.
and the people
And I
involved were American. You
and
know,
I like the fact that he doesn't shy away. Like a lot of these books, they don't want to discuss. They're like, "Oh, this was printed by, Western Islands, or this was printed." He mentions Major Jordan's diaries. He mentions, that like Sean McMeekin I talked about last episode. He covers this stuff too. But this guy was doing it in '08, and I think, some of the people dinged him like he's using McCarthy as sources, and it reminds me almost of like the Soviet Union show trials. It's like, no, you can't use revisionist, you can't use deviationist ideology. McCarthy's bad. How dare you, comrade? Talk about how like that McCarthy and these authors like John Noble or whatever were good. Like, no, these are wreckers. They're saboteurs.
yes,
So,
yes,
so
yes. It's very much also. where the burden of proof is on you, you
Yeah.
know, and we can, we can set the bar arbitrarily high,
Yeah.
and the bar for us is arbitrarily low. So, right, it's
What
it's
bar?
still very, it never went away. Maybe we'll see a change soon where either the right in America might actually start winning, or all this stuff will be far enough in the past that it'll just become a historical
Yeah.
matter of interest.
It won't be a minefield anymore. It'll just be like, yeah. And we can only hope, right? I mean, this stuff should be widely proliferated. I think this story and it's ongoing, in the previous one, there's so much stuff about this time that is just not known by the average person, but I think it should be. If you're gonna learn about, the stuff that, it's like with the Native American grave sites and stuff and can they, it turns out this stuff's not even like these mission schools, they don't find these mass graves. So it's like are you telling me that your regime doesn't have enough real crimes where you have to actually invent crimes? Like there's plenty of stuff. If you want to like get mad about America in the 20th century, like and you're like, "Oh, this is like the perfect place to start." If you were actually interested in like you know, the stuff that it did that was wrong, there's plenty of you could fill an encyclopedia with it. Like and of course this is not touched with a 10-foot pole and we're just going to talk about you know what I mean? It's just it's insanity, man. I
Well,
mean,
we're talking about it.
yeah,
That's one of the
we
reasons why we're
are,
here.
but I mean,
So
like, no one in if you go to like a college though, this is not going to show up in your like required, you know what I
curriculum,
mean?
it's not going
Yeah,
to be in your
exactly.
curriculum.
But
Um,
yeah,
okay, so we're right over 2 hours. I think we can wrap it up here. Um,
certainly.
Thank you guys very much for being with us today with Dictators Dan and myself. And please leave us a comment, like this stuff, subscribe, etc. Thank you very
Thanks for
much.
having me on, Baruch.
Thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Bye.